Hello everybody, today I'm going to be going over how I went from this 2D concept to this 3D rendering all in Blender 3D. So the first thing that I like to do when I get started in Blender is to throw up a reference of what I'm modeling in the background and then start modeling to that. I just start throwing ideas into the viewport and start with very simple objects and kind of work my way up to the final thing. I basically followed this process for the entire modeling workflow, starting from the main chassis, the cylindrical part, and then I worked on all of the limbs. I did all of the appendages to the actual sci-fi droid using the same concept, just kind of blocking it out using simple shapes and then refining it from there. And it's just a huge help to not get bogged down and kind of think everything has to be perfect, because honestly you can use very simple shapes, and then if you need a more complicated shape later on or you need to adjust something, it's comforting to know that you didn't spend that much time on it to begin with. And I like to keep in mind that I'm not going to use everything that I model, which is another reason why it's important to keep things simple, because if it took me 30 seconds to make a certain little component, I'm not going to be as afraid to get rid of that and replace it with something new as if I had spent 10-15 minutes modeling this one little intricate part. So I think that's some good tips, is just not getting bogged down on the details too much. You can always come back later and resolve those issues. This is one of my first projects where I was designing something more mechanically inclined in Blender. So I wanted it to actually be functional. I wanted the mechanics of the robot to work. In reality, that's not always possible, and quite frankly, you're gonna have a lot of stuff that isn't actually possible going on in your geometry. And that's fine. That's kind of the beauty of working in 3D, and not, if you could make it perfect, you could build the thing in real life. So it's okay to have some clipping and some bad geometry, so long as it, in the end game, it works for what you need. When I'm modeling, I always like to keep in mind that I have to rig that later, especially in something like this where I know that I'm going to end up animating this robot to do certain things. And the way that you make your model affects how your rigging is going to be done later on. I had some problems with my mesh where I was having difficulty setting my origins just right, and then I lost track of where my the object axes were. So later on, when I went to parent those objects to a bone in my armature, it was very difficult to get that figured out. It's always best to keep in mind that you're going to rig it down the road, and so that you can model according to those restrictions. This is just me, but I like to be able to see the results of what I'm working on relatively frequently, because it gives me some motivation to keep going through the next part of the project. It can get really tedious and bog you down real fast if you get into too much details, or you're rigging for hours, or you're modeling for hours. Whatever it is, it's good to have those little wins to give you more motivation to keep going. So even though I hadn't finished with all of my rigging yet, and I wasn't completely set on the model that I wanted, I went ahead and set up some quick test renders just to, give myself some motivation that, I was getting closer to the end goal. I mean, at this point, things were starting to shape up, and so I wanted to set up those renders to see how close I was getting to the 2D concept. Having all of your bones named properly will help you in the rigging process later on, because when you're doing your parenting from the object to the bone, you can easily tell which bone you're parenting to. And since you already named your objects, you know exactly which object belongs to which bone. Once I had most of the rigging kind of finished how I wanted it, I went ahead and plopped the whole thing into the animation tab, and I went to work on rendering an animation. Just kind of getting it set up and seeing if the mechanics of the armature worked how I wanted it to. And I also started playing around with the pose libraries, which I wasn't familiar with. I don't think that those existed before 3.0, so I haven't used that before. Once I started placing the rig and getting some animation done, things started falling into place and it was really starting to shape up. So what I went ahead and did is worked on a little test animation where it transforms. I put some camera motion in there, added some camera shake, and it was really starting to look good. Once I got that finished, I went ahead and modeled some like simple missiles and created some parents for them, and I did some missile animation. When it comes to doing things that have physics involved, I like to be as close as possible to the way I think that a real missile would launch, or the way I think that physical thing would actually move in the real world. And I think that that's a good practice to have. There are some times where you can take creative liberty, and if it looks better, you don't have to be physically accurate, but a lot of times the physically accurate version doesn't look as odd to somebody looking outside in on your project. I'm not sure if this is a normal thing to do, but I wanted some like stylized lights with the missiles. I wanted them to really impact the lighting in the environment. And I knew that the smoke simulation, the smoke fire simulation that I was gonna do later on wasn't gonna provide the light that I needed. So what I did is I took these little emission planes that weren't visible to the camera, and I parented them to the missile. That way, whenever the missile leaves the rocket launcher, that little card goes along with it, lighting up the environment. Now, the light doesn't turn on until after the missile has been launched, so fortunately it's not lighting up the environment the entire time it's rolling. The next order of business was to do a smoke simulation for the missiles, which turned out to be probably one of the biggest pains in this entire project. I'm not super familiar with Blender's simulation settings and how they work, so I ended up doing a little bit of research on the internet to figure out how to do this. But you know, it ended up looking okay, and I got the shaders looking how I wanted them, so I went ahead and just called it good. Now for the background, it didn't end up being as realistic or as good as I might have wanted it to, but I was running out of time and just kind of pieced something together real quick with some real basic shapes like planes and cubes. Created some lighting fixtures on the ceiling, and it's supposed to be kind of like a darker parking garage look. For the rocket engines, I was also going to do a smoke simulation, but I was having all sorts of problems trying to figure out how to do that one as well. So basically what I did is I used an alternative approach that I found on YouTube, and basically just used a solid model to simulate the rocket fire. I think that it looked pretty good, and in terms of computing budget, it worked out a lot better in the long run. Finally, I hit render, and it took forever. It took forever to get this stupid render done. It's taken me several days, several crashes, supervising it like it's a child. It's been frustrating, but finally got it to render, and this is the final result. Well guys, that's it. I hope you liked it. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks.